So for a quick historical overview, in 1975, Public Law 94-142 was known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and this is what first established free and appropriate public education for school-aged children, for all school-aged children. So really, prior to 1975, there was no law that guaranteed special education services to children who had disabilities. But this law really only covered children who were of school age. In 1986, EHA was amended through Public Law 99-457 to add services for children aged birth to 3, which is what we now know as IDEA Part C, or infant toddler services, but began as this public law in the mid-80s. In 1990, we had the first iteration of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and that law was reauthorized in 1997 and 2004. So really, IDEA as we know it today began in 1990 and has continued to be updated and reauthorized over the past couple of decades. Now, what we're really concerned about in physical therapy and providing services to children through IDEA are Parts B and Part C. So we're going to start today by talking about IDEA Part B. And I'm going to start by talking about a few of the provisions of IDEA Part B. So IDEA Part B offers free and appropriate public education, also known as FAPE, for children aged 3 through 21 years. So this is what we know as special education in public schools. Now you might notice that the age range is 3 through 21 years, and we may typically think of school age as being more of, about age 5 or 6 when we enter kindergarten through approximately age 18 when we graduate. And that is the average school age for children who are typically developing. But for children who are identified as children with disabilities, public education is guaranteed beginning on their 3rd birthday through their 21st birthday. So children can access services through the public school system from age 3 through 21. Another provision of IDEA Part B is the least restrictive environment. And what IDEA Part B says is that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities should be educated with children who are not disabled. So this just is really about inclusion and including children with disabilities with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. IDEA Part B also provides related services, and this is really important for us physical therapists because physical therapy is a related service. So PT is a related service, and what IDEA says is that physical therapy and other related services should be provided as may be required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. So it's really providing services for children in IDEA Part B is really a different framework and a different way of thinking about services, because rather than being a primary service where physical therapy is the primary goal, we have to really think about how we can provide services that are educationally relevant. Other related services besides PT include transportation, speech, audiology, psychology, occupational therapy, as well as recreation, medical, and counseling services. IDEA also provides assistive technology for students. Assistive technology, can be devices, so these can be off-the-shelf, modified, or customized devices that will increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of children with disabilities. And this assistive technology can also be in the form of services that directly assist with selection, acquisition, or use of assistive technology devices. So assistive technology can be devices or the services needed to support those devices. IDEA Part B also lays out the plan for the child, which is known as the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail later. So under IDEA Part B, an evaluation is what is done to determine eligibility for services. So evaluation under IDEA Part B has a different definition than what we think of as an evaluation as defined in the Guide to Physical Therapist Practice. So remember, throughout this lesson, when I talk about evaluation, I'm talking about evaluation as defined by IDEA. So an evaluation through IDEA is not discipline specific. So there's no such thing as a physical therapy evaluation and a speech therapy evaluation and an educational evaluation. An evaluation is a multidisciplinary evaluation that puts together information from all aspects and facets of development and education. The evaluation must be done in natural environments, so we have to do observation of the child in their natural setting, in the classroom, in the school. Evaluations are supposed to be done or conducted to, quote, assist in determining whether a child is a child with a disability. So in other words, an evaluation is done to determine whether the child is eligible for special education services. So how do we know whether they're eligible? Well, the law, IDEA, actually defines 14 different disabilities. And so the child, as a result of that evaluation, the child has to meet the criteria for one of these 14 disabilities defined by IDEA. And you can see these disabilities defined in detail in box 30-1 of your textbook. So once the evaluation is completed, and we've determined that the child does indeed meet the criteria for one of those 14 categories of disabilities, then the child is to be provided special education services, and these services are documented in the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP. The IEP is developed by the team. It is reviewed and rewritten once a year. And depending on the school district, sometimes that can be at the end of each school year, sometimes that can be around the child's birthday, and sometimes it can be another time in the school year, but it does have to be reviewed and rewritten at least once per year. It can be reviewed and revised and rewritten more frequently if needed, but at minimum it must be reviewed and rewritten yearly. The IEP includes a present level of academic achievement and functional performance. It includes measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals. Benchmarks and short-term objectives are not required under IDEA 2004. And remember that these annual goals may not necessarily be discipline-specific goals. There may be no such thing in an IEP as, quote, PT goals. There may be more global goals about participating in recess or physical education time or lunch time, and then as a physical therapist, then you can determine how you may be able to help address that goal. There is a description of how progress toward the annual goals will be measured and when periodic reports on the child's progress will be provided. So oftentimes school districts will send home progress reports with report cards, so quarterly and sometimes midterm or mid-quarter reports, but other school districts choose to do things differently. And so it doesn't matter how you do it, you just have to document how you're going to measure progress and how you're going to report that progress. The IEP should include a statement of special education related services, supplementary aids and services, based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practical. So in other words, this just says that the IEP should say what types of services the child is going to receive, and those recommendations should be based on peer-reviewed research as much as possible. And the IEP should also include a transition plan beginning at the first IEP to be in effect when the child is 16. So usually that transition plan actually occurs when the child is 15 for the IEP that will cover the time when they reach their 16th birthday. The IEP should also include an explanation of the extent to which the child will not participate with non-disabled peers. So remember, we're supposed to be providing services in the least restrictive environment. So when we're going to be taking that child away from their non-disabled peers, we have to document and justify why we're doing that. The IEP should also include a statement of accommodations necessary for state and district-wide assessment, so any testing accommodations, and also the projected date for beginning of services, modifications, frequency, location, and duration of services. So as a physical therapist, you're going to have to include in that IEP how often you're going to see that child and where you're going to see them, and how those services are going to be provided. So once the IEP is developed, the child's determined to be eligible for special education, and the IEP is developed to identify the child's special education needs. Then we determine how the physical therapist can contribute to the IEP. So it's important to remember that a motor delay or disability does not necessarily qualify a child for school-based PT. The child has to meet the criteria for special education in one of the categories of disability, and then only at that time is a determination made whether the child needs the unique expertise of PT to be able to access and participate in his or her education. So depending on the IDEA doesn't outline specific requirements for qualifying for school-based physical therapy. That's really up to the interpretation of the state or the school district of how they determine whether children then need physical therapy services. But according to the law, physical therapy services must relate to educational needs and be required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. So again, services must be educationally relevant. Physical therapists should help contribute measurable annual academic and functional goals. And again, short-term goals are not required by IDEA federal law. However, according to best practice and oftentimes practice acts, short-term goals are best practice. So oftentimes physical therapists will keep their own supplemental record that may have some short-term goals. Or some school districts will actually allow or have short-term goals in the IEP. Oftentimes it's okay to do more than what's required by law. You just can't do less. So if your school district supports putting short-term goals in the IEP, that's fine. They're just not required. In a school-based setting, there are a number of models of service delivery, and these are described in detail in your textbook, but can be described as direct services. So these oftentimes are thought of as more kind of pull-out, very one-on-one, hands-on, traditional services that are really not necessarily always considered. Sometimes they're needed in a school setting, but for the most part, these are services. Direct pull-out services are not desirable in a school-based setting. We really want to look more at integrated services where we're going into the child's classroom during routines and really helping to support that child's education in normal and natural daily routines. Services may also be provided on a consultative, monitoring, or collaborative basis. There's much discussion on determining frequency and intensity of service delivery, and in your textbook they have discussion about intensive services 3+ times per week, which is pretty rare in a school-based setting. More often we see services weekly or every other week. Sometimes periodic services where we just see a child monthly or quarterly. Sometimes these are kind of considered monitoring type services, and then we also can function as a consultant and just see this child on a consultative basis or as needed. But when we're considering the frequency and intensity of service delivery, we really have a number of things we need to consider. We need to consider what their potential is to benefit from the intervention, because remember, on any time that we are taking them out of something to provide physical therapy services, they're missing part of their education. So we really have to make sure that what we're doing is really supporting and benefiting their education. We need to ask ourselves if this is a critical period of skill acquisition or regression, because we know that at a time when children tend to be developing skills or even losing skills, that's really a critical time for intervention. We need to consider the amount of the motor program that can be safely performed by others. So if we can teach other people who spend time with the child, then that's obviously more desirable, because those tasks that can then be carried out more frequently throughout the day by people who are with the child all the time. And then we also have to consider the amount of training that's been provided by the PT to others carrying out the program, and also the impact of motor problems and the environment on the educational program. So all things to consider when thinking about the frequency and intensity of service delivery. And as discussed in the Guide to Physical Therapist Practice, and I'm sure in a lot you've discussed this in other courses and other settings, interventions, it can be a number of things in a school-based setting. We do a lot of coordination, communication, and documentation in a school-based environment. We're really trying to do a lot of teaching and coaching and supporting the teachers and aides who are working with the child, and really providing a lot of child and family, teacher, and staff-related instruction. And although procedural interventions are obviously a significant part of what we do in school-based therapy, they're probably the sort of least focused type of intervention in school-based practice. We really focus a lot on trying to adapt the environment to support and teach teachers and aides and staff, and really coordinate and communicate to provide good supportive care for children in their educational environment. So what if a child does not qualify for special education but still needs PT? That's a question that gets asked often. And the answer to that is there's the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So this is separate from IDEA, but wanted to mention it briefly. And this Section 504 is a broad anti-discrimination statute that's designed to prevent discrimination and provide equal opportunity for people with disabilities. And so it's been used to broaden students' eligibility for related services in school. The definition of, quote, qualified handicapped persons under Section 504 is broader than under IDEA. So if a child doesn't require special education according to those defined disabilities that we discussed under IDEA, they may be eligible for services under Section 504. And so it's important for school-based therapists to understand that when we are part of an evaluation and we have significant concerns about a child's physical therapy needs in a school setting, but that child does not qualify for special education because they don't meet the criteria for one of those categories of disability, we may be able to still see them. A good example of this might be the child with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, for example. That child may not have any learning disabilities, any other need for special education, and their juvenile rheumatoid arthritis may not be significant enough where they qualify for services with an orthopedic impairment or other health impairment, but they may certainly have a need for some modification and supports and services from a physical therapist. So that's an example of a type of diagnosis that you may not necessarily see that child qualify for special education, but they still may benefit from the expertise of physical therapy. And in that case, you could explore providing those services through Section 504. So moving on to IDEA Part C. So Part C services are early intervention services for eligible infants and toddlers, birth to 3 years, and their families. So while IDEA Part C services are for age 3 through 21 and are educationally relevant services, IDEA Part C services are for infants and toddlers, and they're developmental and family-centered services. Services in IDEA Part C have to be provided in natural environments. That's actually laid out in the law. And natural environments are defined as settings that are natural or normal for the child's age peers who have no disabilities. So this can be any place where children participate in activities and routines that promote development. It can include homes, childcare settings, parks, community centers, grocery stores, and more. So really a natural environment doesn't just mean the home. It really can be anywhere where children with and without disabilities learn and play. Similar to the evaluation process in IDEA Part B, evaluation under IDEA Part C is comprehensive, multidisciplinary, and is used to determine eligibility. And depending on the state and the early intervention network, the evaluation for early intervention services may actually be conducted by a separate evaluation team, and then that evaluation team may send their results to the team that will actually provide the services. Now, I do want to mention that just because we an evaluation under IDEA is only used to determine eligibility, and there's not really any such thing as a discipline-specific, PT evaluation. That doesn't mean that as a physical therapist that you don't do ongoing assessment, but that's the terminology that we use in this environment. So when we think about maybe our more discipline-specific kind of targeted assessment that we do, we use the terminology assessment, and that really refers to that ongoing process of identifying the child's strengths and needs, services that'll meet the child's needs, family concerns and priorities, and supports and services. So when we do that evaluation, in order to determine if a child is eligible for Part C services, they must have a developmental delay or disability in one or more of the following areas of development: physical, cognitive, communication, social or emotional, or adaptive. And that's really all the law says, the federal law for Part C. So Part C, while Part B services eligibility is clearly outlined by federal law and is the same in every state, for Part C services, eligibility is different from state to state. So different states interpret the law differently and have their own criteria for eligibility. So for example, in Kansas, children are eligible for Part C services if they have a diagnosed mental or physical condition that has a high probability of resulting in a developmental delay, or if they actually have a developmental delay. And the state of Kansas defines a developmental delay as a 25% or more than 1.5 standard deviations below the mean in one area. So one of those 5 areas of development: physical, cognitive, communication, or social, emotional, or adaptive. Or a 20% delay or more than 1 standard deviation below the mean in 2 areas. Missouri, on the other hand, defines a developmental delay as a 50% delay in at least 1 area. So just contrasting that, in Kansas, if a child has a 25% delay in 1 area, they would qualify, where in Missouri they have to have a 50% delay. So there's really different criteria, and so a lot of children would qualify for services in Kansas who would not qualify in Missouri. And another important point to remember is that these areas are fairly broad. So for example, as physical therapists, we would really be looking at and helping with the evaluation piece that would address physical development, but physical development encompasses both gross motor and fine motor. So if a child has delays in gross motor but does not have delays in fine motor, then they may not meet that eligibility criteria, because you have to put those things together. So if they're 25% delayed in gross motor but they're 25% advanced in fine motor, you put that together, they look average when you look at total physical development. Communication is similar. They don't separate expressive and receptive language. So sometimes children can have really good receptive language and very poor expressive language, but they won't qualify for services because when you put it all together, it doesn't look like they have a delay, even though maybe one facet of communication is quite delayed. So once a child has been evaluated and it's determined that they are eligible for early intervention Part C services according to the state requirements, an Individualized Family Service Plan is developed, or an IFSP. The IFSP is developed by the team. It's reviewed every 6 months, but rewritten yearly. And again, it can be reviewed and rewritten more frequently if desired by the team. The IFSP includes a statement of a present level of development, a discussion of family resources, priorities, and concerns, measurable outcomes. And it's important to note that in the IFSP is a very family-centered, family-driven document. So outcomes are determined by the family and based on what is important to the family. These are not discipline-specific goals. So similar to the process for an IEP, The IFSP is developed based on family needs, and then once that document's developed, then we determine whether the physical therapist expertise is needed to address those needs. The IFSP also includes a statement of the early intervention services, so physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, etc. Documentation of the natural environments where those services will be provided, and every IFSP includes a transition plan. And remember, children transition to Part B public schools services on their 3rd birthday. So every IFSP includes some planning for a transition, although obviously that becomes more detailed as the child gets older. So when looking at how the PT contributes to the IFSP, it's important to remember that the IFSP must be family directed. So the physical therapist and other service providers can certainly make recommendations, but those recommendations must be consistent with information obtained in family interview. They should be very strengths-based, use lay language, and be flexible. And ultimately, Part C services are very family-centered and driven by family needs and priorities. And so that can really be challenging sometimes for physical therapists who have very strong opinions about what a child may need, but if those needs aren't in line with the family, then the IFSP and then therefore the services won't be addressing those needs. So it's very important for the physical therapist to just really think carefully about how he or she can provide services that are really going to enhance the family and be responsive to family needs and priorities. Similarly, interventions must support family outcomes. They should be routines-based, so as much as we can, if the family is really struggling with bath time, and that's one of the outcomes, then we should try as much as we can to actually come to the home during bath time and provide our interventions during bath time so we can really address those routines and address those family needs. Interventions may address play, socialization, caregiving and self-care, environmental adaptations, and assistive technologies. And they should try to balance adult-directed learning opportunities, so family and caregiver education, with child-directed activities. So really, in Part C services, you're really serving both the child and the family and have to really balance that. As I mentioned previously, transition planning is part of every IFSP, but the planning becomes a lot more intentional towards the child's 3rd birthday. So at about age 2.5, the Part B program usually holds a meeting, an IEP meeting, and they will typically invite the Part C representative. So this is a member of the Part C people who are currently serving the child with the Part B service providers who will be serving the child. And then prior to the child's 3rd birthday, an IEP meeting is held to really put the IEP in place so that the child can transition to the Part B program on his 3rd birthday. And this is just kind of a slide to just sort of basically lay out the differences between medical and educational services. You've spent quite a bit of time and training already on medical services, so educational services and the framework and kind of theory behind educational services is probably what's very new. But when we think about medical versus educational services are regulated by healthcare laws, whereas educational services are regulated by education laws. In a medical model, therapy is provided to assist the child to be as functionally independent as possible, and in an educational model, therapy is provided to assist a child to benefit from special education. Medical services are medically necessary, whereas educational services are educationally relevant. And this is a really important distinction. Oftentimes services are medically necessary, but they're not appropriate to be provided in an educational environment. And similarly, but this is typically a bit more obvious to people, educationally relevant services aren't typically appropriate to deliver in a medical setting. So there are very different sort of frameworks and purposes of those settings. In a medical setting, any child can really receive services. Sometimes we're limited by healthcare coverage and things of that nature. But in an educational setting, the child must be identified as having an educational disability and has to demonstrate a need for the special expertise of a PT to support their special education. And then this is just sort of a real quick and dirty chart to compare IDEA Parts B and C. And so again, Part B is 3 through 21, Part C is birth through 3. Part B eligibility is defined in categories of disabilities defined by federal law, whereas eligibility for Part C varies by state. Documentation for Part B is an IEP and Part C is an IFSP. And services for Part B are educationally relevant, whereas Part C services are family-centered and developmental.